In this video I'm going to show you another game played by the world champion Ding Liren, in which he horribly blunders, and this is a very instructive mistake, and I will show you how you can avoid these kind of mistakes. Well, let's have a look at the game. Wei Yi playing with the white pieces against Ding Liren. Wei Yi is also Super Grandmaster, number 2 of China and number 16 in the world, so not an easy opponent at all. And in fact, both players are just warming up in this rapid event in China to play next week in the Tata Steel Masters in the Netherlands. Let's see what happens in this game, as it's a very sharp battle. Wei Yi is a 1e4 player, also goes for it in this line. And we know from the World Championship matches that Ding Liren is a main specialist in the line starting with e5 with the black pieces. But for this occasion, he goes for the move c6. It's the Caro-Kann. d4, d5, knight c3, pawn takes, knight takes, and a very popular line with the move knight f6. So white can take the knight, double the pawns on the f-file. But this is a modern way of playing so that you can quickly get your bishop out. White plays the move c3 to support a pawn on d4. The bishop comes to d6. The bishop goes to d3, and after castling kingside, white goes for the move queen c2, hitting the pawn on h7. This is all very standard opening theory nowadays. Rook e8 check, and the knight blocks the check by going to e2. And how is black going to defend that pawn on h7, which is now threatened to be taken? Well, look at this. The pawn goes to h5. This is a very interesting idea, and very often the pawn, the h-pawn, can be used to prevent the white knight coming to g3 later on, or perhaps even the pawn can even move up the board to h3, trying to provoke new weaknesses on the king side. So here white basically has to decide what he's going to do. He can of course consider castling kingside, but in this game bishop e3 is played, and now after the move knight d7, white castles queenside. So this is a different position. Opposite castled kings, both sides will look for opportunities to start hitting the enemy's king. And well, interestingly, this position was also reached in the first rapid game, which I will quickly show you what happened there. Because Ding Liren played here the move b5, and now white goes for the move d5, challenging the pawn on c6. Black goes for the move c5. He is sacrificing the pawn on b5. This is still opening theory. The rook goes to b8 to hit the bishop. The rook is well placed, looking at the pawn on b2. White played the move c4, a6, attacking the bishop on b5. And the bishop goes to c6. Now the rook goes to e7, getting out of the pin so that the rook will not be hanging. And after the move knight c3, the knight goes to e5, putting pressure against that bishop. But here the knight comes to e4, and this is a critical moment in which black could just have gone here for the move bishop f5. But instead, look what happened. Bishop g4 was played, hitting the rook on d1. And now after rook d2, the bishop went back to f5 anyway. This is looking strange. The bishop is well placed, but the rook is pretty well placed on the second rank, guarding that pawn on b2. Now, there followed this. Knight takes f6, discover check as you're attacking the bishop. Pawn takes knight, queen takes f5. And now it's the move knight takes c4, attacking the rook. White decided here to ignore the threat, take the pawn on f6. And after knight takes d2, queen g5, king f8, queen h6, the king cannot run away. And so the game just ended in a perpetual. Should be said though that if black had played the move bishop f5 right away, he may have won this game. Because now the very same tactic with knight takes f6. You're winning a pawn, but there is the move queen a5 with very strong threats against the white king. For instance, if you do take the pawn now it's queen takes a2 with a mating threat on b2. And if you do give a check, you can always block with a knight. And therefore it looks as if black is winning here. Another important tactical line is that if you do save the pawn on a2 by playing king b1, it's rook takes b2. Devastating blow to white's position. King takes, and now knight takes c4 with check. The king is caught in a mating net. If you go king a1, for instance, it's queen c3 with mate to come. You may go for a move like king c2, but then the queen can just take the pawn on a2 and mate will follow very soon. Anyway, interesting game. In the second game, the blitz game, Ding Liren deviated from that rapid game. He didn't play the move b5, but instead played another very thematical move, knight f8. The knight is well placed here, it opens up the path for the bishop, and the knight is guarding the black king. White goes for the move king b1, and now you can get your bishop out and just continue developing, but another interesting plan in such positions is launching the a-pawn. White plays the move c4, so the pawns are getting stronger in the center. But now the pawn goes to a4. Intending to come to a3, White has the possibility to stop that by playing here the move a3 himself. Was not played. White played the move h3. And you see both pawns, both sides are trying to open up the opponent's position. One of the ideas of h3 is to prepare getting in this move g4. Black goes for a3. White wants to keep queen side closed. Played here the move b3, bishop d7, knight c3. The knight is coming over to support the king. Bishop b4, and here the move g4 is played. Very interesting idea, as obviously if you do take the pawn on g4, that opens up the h-file. Looks very risky, so thematical response, perhaps not even the best move, but very typical for these structures, is to play here the move h4. So that the rook on h1 remains out of play. White wants to get the rook involved. Played here the move rook h to g1. Interesting idea. Another plan is to play here the move knight e4, keeping the knight on the board, and maybe the rook can later come to the f-file to help supporting the advance of the f-pawn. It's a different approach. Let's see what happened. Rook h to g1. Knight e6. Knight is putting a bit of pressure against the pawn on d4, not really threatening to take it at the moment. But the idea is that after the move knight e4, black can now here play the move knight g5. That's a very interesting defensive resource. So that you're offering the exchange of knights, which is what happened in the game, but you see that the rook on g1 will remain out of play because the files are simply closed on that side. On the other hand, if you purely look at the pawn formation, black has a double pawn on the g-file. That's not the greatest pawn, of course, and white is having a better pawn structure in the center. But it's not easy at all, and if the position will get open at some point, then there is this pawn on a3, and that means that the king on b1 always have to be very alert, not falling into any mating traps, for instance. So here, bishop f5 is played, anchoring the bishop on a nice square. It's supported by the queen, and well, there are various options. You can just exchange the bishop on f5, but probably Ding Liren didn't want to play it because now the pawn on g5 is under attack. But nice idea I wanted to show you is just to kick the queen, because if white would take the pawn on g5 now, you can go for the exchange of queens and the rook enters on the second rank. Things are dangerous here. The rook is very active with ideas to give a check or take the pawn on f2. I think this is absolutely okay for black. But Ding played the move rook a5. That's of course another advantage, having pushed your pawn up the board to a3. The rook can be activated via the fifth rank. It's now putting pressure against the bishop, and white closes the position here with the move c5. Now the bishop on b4, it's kind of out of play, and the rook as well. They are not doing that much, but at the same time you're giving up some control over the d5 square. So the most natural move here would be just to put the bishop on e6. No need to go for the exchange of bishops yourself. You would like to gain control over this square, and it will be harder for white to utilize the pawn on the d-file. In the game instead, Ding opted for a more dynamical continuation as he played here this move b6, which is understandable because he wants to get rid of that annoying pawn. If this pawn is no longer there, then the rook and the bishop will come into play. For instance, if you do take the pawn on b6. There's no time to take the pawn there because the bishop on f5 will take the bishop on d7. But first you can put the rook on d5. That's kind of stable, protecting the bishop on d7, and very soon you're about to wrap up the pawn on b6. It's a sharp game. I think black is doing reasonably well. So for that reason, instead of taking the pawn, look at what happened here. Wei Yi went for this move, d5, placing another pawn on the 5th rank, really trying to cut off the black pieces, and it's a really sharp continuation. Let me show you. If you would take the pawn on d5, well, there is this possibility of taking the pawn on b6 that looks like a very strong passed pawn, and the rook on a5 doesn't cover the 5th rank. But if you do place your rook on b5, you have the idea to play bishop a5 and eliminate that pawn on b6 very soon. I think black is in reasonable shape, but instead of taking that pawn on d5, look what Ding played here. And don't forget, guys, this is a blitz game. He thought he can just take the pawn on c5. And this is a horrible blunder, and probably he had just been counting on white capturing the pawn on c6 with a huge pressure against that bishop on d7. But probably he had been counting on this, that he can take on f5 now, solving the pin by taking on f5, attacking the queen. And if you do take on f5, well, then you can move the queen away with the idea of taking the pawn on c6. This is actually not an easy position for black at all. There's a very long sequence of moves starting with rook d7 in which white is about to threaten checkmate on f7. If you go back, then you try to save the pawn on e4, and well, black is in trouble, but it's a fighting position. But instead of taking that pawn on c6, there's a much easier move which was overlooked by Ding in this game. Because what kind of moves you always have to look at? Very simple. Always consider checks. Now you would like to take the pawn on c6, but the bishop on f5 can still be taken. Much stronger is to insert this check, bishop h7. Not that the bishop is that brilliantly placed on in the corner there, but it does force the king to go to h8, and now you can safely take the pawn on c6, attacking the bishop. The bishop cannot go away because then you lose the queen, and now of course the difference is that black no longer has the option to take on f5. That's very important, and that means that black is just completely busted. He decided here to take on e3. Now you may take back on e3, but then there is still the move rook c5 with some tactical complications. Black is just trying to save its position by bringing the rook to the c file, attacking the queen, hitting the pawn on c6. But instead, here again, Wei Yi just goes for the much simpler move. Instead of taking back, he takes on d7. So the bishop on e3 is still hanging, but also the rook on e8. So if you move the rook, well, then you can just take the bishop on e3. Well, in fact, after the move rook e6, the rook is no longer guarding the back rank. And now the fastest way to win is even not to take the bishop, but try to let your d-pawn promote. And you can do that by means of the move queen c8. And here Ding resigned. You can take on c8, but then white just recaptures and gets a new queen. It's just completely winning. If you try to come back with the move rook a8, now beautiful tactical idea here is just to take on a8. Try to deflect the defender from the promotion square. After queen takes, you promote your d-pawn with check. Black has to take, you take back with check. Black will capture your bishop, but now you finally take that bishop on e3. White is a rook up, and that's of course not interesting for black to play at all. So therefore, after the move queen c8, Ding Liren resigned and ended up on the 4th place in this first China Chess King tournament. Great result for Wei Yi. Disappointing result for the world champion, of course. Not great at all, but it's a good warming up for what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks in Wei Yi. He is warned and he needs to improve his tactical skills for the upcoming games. Let's see if he's capable of doing that. Hopefully you find this video instructive. Please subscribe to this channel for more instructive video analysis. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon again. Bye bye.